can we go on with this conversation then? We'll see. Now,
Sure.
is there another subsequent faith experience you would like to share? Perhaps you feed into the first experience with God.
There's so many experiences that I could think about, but here's one of the things that that still is something that I carry as something that I look back to draw strength from.
Yes.
I remember, it really had to do with my relationship, with my father. And my father, when I was growing up, my father was like raised, a different way. And he was very hard, right? He never really had that connection with me where I was able to open up to him about some of the things I was struggling with in my life growing up.
Mm-hmm.
And so both my father and I, eventually, our relationship went apart. And both I think it was my brother and I, we both had the same experience with our father. But my father's experience with God was something that helped me, have this connection with God and then have certain experiences that were similar to him. And so in order for me to share this, I got to share with you just what happened with my father. So to kind of paint the picture, he was a person that was far from God himself. And my mother was the prayer warrior in our family. She prayed for both my father, my siblings, and I. She'll pray 3 times a day for all of us, because she was the only one in the house that had a strong relationship with God. She was the only one that had a relationship with God.
Right.
The first person that she was praying about was my father. And when she was praying for my father, she was praying that my father would become somebody that would dedicate his life to God. At the time, my father was somebody that never saw any value in Christianity. And the situation that changed his life was when his car broke down coming home from work. And when his car broke down, he had 2 items in the car. He had a beer crate and he had a 20 kg sack of potato. He could only take one of those items to the nearest bus stop. And so where his life was at the time, he left the 20 kg sack of potatoes and he took the beer crate. And so he took the beer crate, took it to the bus stop, and he sat on it waiting for his bus. Now, right there at the bus stop, behind the bus stop was a school. There was a hall at that school where an evangelist was conducting a 3-week evangelism crusade.
Mm-hmm.
My father heard quickly the songs that were, being sung, and he knew, oh, this is an evangelism crusade happening. And so he was just, I could just see his frustration, probably waiting for the bus to turn up sometime soon.
Yeah.
But as he was sitting on this beer crate, waiting for the bus to turn up, the preacher had started preaching, and he can hear the sound of the preacher from behind him, and coming from the building. The bus turns up finally about 20 minutes into the sermon. As everybody was standing and lining up going into the bus, he decides to wait for the next one.
Oh.
So the bus goes, and my father stays where he is. 20 minutes later, another bus comes. This time it's 40 minutes into the sermon, and people jump onto the bus. Others are coming off, and still my father didn't jump on. He let the bus go. He was waiting until the sermon had finished. He was locked into what the preacher was preaching about.
Clearly.
As soon as the last bus came, he jumped on that bus, went home, put the beers in the fridge, went to work the following day, and his boss said, I heard your car broke down. I can take you home after this. My father says, no, it's fine. I'll catch the bus. He goes back to that same bus stop as he continues to listen to the seminar that continued for the next 3 weeks, and he would sit at that bus stop for the next 3 weeks. And when the preacher made an altar call, He walked from outside of that bus stop into the building and gave his life to God right then and there.
Amen.
So, my father was baptized. Now, putting that to the side, my brother, there's only two of us boys in the family. My brother, who had followed in my footsteps in a lot of gang-related activities, both my brother and I. My brother was in court, and whenever my brother and I were in court, only my mother would turn up to our court cases. My father would never turn up to our court cases. But my brother was there, standing trial, and waiting, for the judge to just make the announcement, give the verdict. But that day, my mother walks into the courtroom, and behind her comes my father.
Wow.
And behind my father comes church members. And they came into that courtroom, and usually the courtroom is filled with gang members that would support my brother and I.
Yeah.
This time, it's my parents and church folk that outnumbered gang members at the courthouse.
Yeah.
And they began praying, and my brother, when he tells the story, he says it was unbelievable. It was like these prayer warriors had just walked into the room, and as the court case was going, they were praying, and my father felt like prayer, wasn't enough at this point. He needed to act as well, right? In the middle of this court case, my father stands up unannounced, and the magistrate had every right to stop him and tell him to sit down.
For sure. Yeah.
But she doesn't. This is, still when we look back to this is a God thing. My father stands up and he says, my son's failure is not his alone. I'm not asking you to give this boy a second chance. I'm asking you to give a father a second chance.
That's powerful.
And so, the magistrate, she took her glasses off, my mother says, and she was confused. She didn't know what to do. And she said, I'm a true believer. If we are going to fix this community, it's going to begin at home. And she says, I don't know what to say right now, but I'm not going to give an answer today. We're going to have to put this on hold until next week. So that court case was put on hold, and my mother walks to my brother as they were taking him back out in chains, back to be locked up. My mother says to my brother, listen, pray at 10 o'clock in the morning and pray at 10 o'clock at night every day until the next court case. Because your father and I and the church will be praying for you at 10 o'clock in the morning and 10 o'clock at night. Wow. They prayed until the following week where he had his trial again, and he was released with bail conditions. And his prayer in prison was, God, if you rescue me from this situation, I will serve you. And so when they released him from that situation, my brother and my father reconciled, and my brother decided he's going to go to Avondale to give his life to God. When my brother went to Avondale, for me, I just got out of prison myself with all the things that I was going through.
Right.
And for me, I was going through a lot of depression, anxiety, mindset was not in the right place. And I had told my mother I wanted to leave this country, New Zealand. Right. And I wanted to know where my brother was. And, my mother said to me, your brother doesn't live here anymore, but I can give you his number and address. And so as she gives me the address and the number, I contacted my brother, and he said he's in Australia and he's starting a whole new life. And I told him I was going to come and see him. Yeah. And so, at the time, I had a 3-year-old son at the time that was no longer in my life at that time. And the reason that my son wasn't in my life at the time was because of my lifestyle at the time. And because his mother didn't want anything to do with me, she she kept herself away from me at that time, and so I never saw my son during those years.
Yeah.
And so that was causing my depression at the time, and really not having that connection with my family as well.
Right.
And so I decided I was going to jump on a plane and go to Australia. And keep in mind, I didn't know anything that was happening in my family at the time. I didn't know what happened to my brother.
Right.
But I was desperate just to get out of the country. And so when eventually, I jumped on a plane, I fly to Sydney, and they arrest me in Sydney.
Really?
They're going to send me back because of my criminal records.
Okay. Interesting. Yes.
And I remember sitting there in this room when they were calling Wellington the capital city of New Zealand. They were trying to figure out what to do with me, if they were going to put me on a plane to send me back home. At that point, I sat on that chair just trying to process everything. And this year was it was 2005, and I remember I was sitting on that chair and I was saying to myself, you know what? I can't believe I had the audacity to think that I could go to Australia and try and change my life. There's no such thing as changing life for someone like me. No such thing as a change of life for someone like me. And I was reasoning with myself, and I don't know whether that was my voice or the enemy, but I was saying to myself, I'm going back to New Zealand, and I'm not going to try and reconnect with my son or my father or my family. I'm just going to go back to gang-related activities, and I'm going to die doing that. But as I was sitting there processing everything, the door opens, and the customs officer comes and takes me, and he sits me down and gives me back my bag and my passport and says, "You can go."
Wow.
Now I was looking at him, and he says, "Yo, we checked everything out. You can go." So I walked out of there, and I couldn't believe what had just happened. And I jumped on the train, 2.5 hours, get to where my brother was. And as soon as I get to my brother, both my brother and I begin sharing stories about how the Lord had, my brother was just talking about what the Lord had done in his life. And so he's the one that kind of introduced me to social media. And when I got onto social media, I found my son and his mother on social media. And he said to me, "Listen, write to her and let her know about, where your life is right now." And when I wrote to her, she never answered a single message for a whole year. Up until about 2006, I flew back to New Zealand, and both of us, we got married and decided that we're going to go back to Australia to start a whole new life.
God be praised.
And when we got back to Australia to start a whole new life, the phone rings, and I remember her picking up that phone and saying to me, "The phone is for you." I told her I was really tired. I had just come back from work. And she said to me, "No, you need to answer this." So I got to the phone and said, "Hello, it's my father."
Wow.
He was saying to me, "I want to come and see my grandson." And I was thinking to myself, like, I don't want to do this right now. And my wife was saying to me, "I think it's good for you to reconnect with your dad. We'd like to connect with your dad."
I agree.
And so I was trying to tell my wife, I said to her, "There's history here that I don't want her to know about." But she said, "Do it." So I ended up answering my father back and saying, "Yes, okay, we'll see you." That weekend, my wife and I went to pick him up from the airport in Sydney. He comes through the airport. My son is running towards him. And I'm looking at the situation thinking, what is going on here? Right? My son is all over him. And my wife walks up and embraces him. And so we get back to my house. My brother's there. We have this beautiful dinner together. And as everyone starts to leave, my wife is going to bed. She's telling me to stay on the table and talk with my
And
dad.
talk with your dad. I agree
We
to that. Yeah.
talk, man.
Yeah.
And so I sat there and I was a man at the time, but you know what? I felt like
Yeah.
I was a boy again,
Yeah.
sitting at that table,
With that.
seeing my dad on the other side.
Right.
And I said, I don't know what is going to happen here. I'm all of a sudden I'm nervous. And when it was just me and my dad, we started talking. He shared about his conversion. He shared about my brother's court case. He shared about what was happening in our family. And then it was at that moment that both my father and I came back together again. We reconnected right then and there. I broke down in front of him, especially when he was telling me about, my brother and my mother's experience with everything, how she was the prayer warrior in our family. And so that was in 2000 and, that was in 2007.
Right.
And so in that year of 2007, when he goes back to New Zealand, we were at the airport. And as we were getting ready to say goodbye to him, he comes over to me and he said to me, Rome, listen, I want you to break the cycle in the family and raise a new generation of God-fearing children, and don't you dare turn back. He told me to, you and your brother, this family, we're going to turn things around. And so I remember nodding my head off to him, not knowing, I didn't know what it was going to look like. I just said to him, I'll do it, only because of this relationship that me and him have right now. And so when he left to go back to New Zealand, he says, don't you dare turn back.
Wow.
And so he went back to New Zealand. I came back and began, reading the Word of God and studying it for myself, and, which led me into going into, to Avondale. So as I look back, the reconciliation, right? And it reminds me of 2 Corinthians chapter 5, where God says he's given to us the ministry of reconciliation. The reconciliation between me and my father, me and my brother, me and my son,
right,
my wife, the ministry of reconciliation. I understood, what it means, for that moment, why God wants so desperately to be back with us again, because that's where my heart was. I wanted to be back with my family. I wanted to be back with my son. And so, every time I think about things that are impossible, like God opened the door for me, to leave the country. God opened the door for me to go and study theology. And God opened the door for me, to come here to the States to do ministry. He continues to do this. And every time things get difficult, I look back into all those impossible situations, and I'm just thinking to myself, well, God opened those doors. God made it possible for me to do these things. And the only logical explanation was faith.
yes,
There's no other way that I could have made any of that happen. That's a God thing. That was something that God gave me to be able to hang my faith on and say, here's something that you can hang your faith on, so that whenever you go through something like this, that you can always look back and see how I have been faithful, to you.
Rome,
and so,
Rome,